On November 12th of 2020, the PS5 is going to launch, and it's going to launch with a brand new controller, the Dualsense. Now, fortunately, Sony decided to release the Dualsense 2 weeks early, on October 30th. And fortunately for me, I managed to get my hands on one. So in this video, let's unbox the Dualsense controller, see how it feels, and then let's rip it apart. Now, overall, the look and feel of the box is pretty basic, with just a picture of the controller on the front, and on the back it mentions some of the features of the controller, including the haptic feedback, adaptive triggers, built-in microphones, and signature comfort. We'll be judging some of that a little bit later on. Now, one thing I did notice on the back, it does say no USB cable is included. That's enough admiring this box. Let's rip this thing open, and let's get our hands on this controller. So finally getting in here and getting a hands-on impression with the controller, my first impression is, number one, this thing feels very premium. And number two, it's really heavy. Quite a bit heavier than either a PS4 controller or a Switch controller, Switch Pro controller, off the top of my head. I'll tell you one thing, Sony spent a lot of time doing their homework on this. A couple details that just jump out at me are, number one, the buttons. They've used a transparent inlay on the buttons. It looks really nice. Then I kind of drew my attention to the sticks, and they feel absolutely fantastic, and those are going to be great for long gaming sessions. But perhaps the nicest detail is the actual shell itself. Sony used almost this embossed square, circle, cross, and triangle. It's awesome, and it feels really good. Now, the controller to compare this most directly to is probably the PS4 controller, and as far as I'm concerned, this thing smokes it in terms of overall fit and feel. The controller is almost a little bit wider in the handles is kind of how I would describe it, and it's a little bit, more beefy, a little bit heavier. Overall, I think it feels and it looks fantastic. Now, like I said, it did feel a little bit heavier, and just to prove that out, I took it a step further and actually weighed the controller, and it comes in at a solid 280 grams, quite a bit heavier than the PS4 controller, and it's even heavier than the Switch controller. Now, it's kind of funny, I actually kind of think the feel of this controller more resembles the Switch Pro controller in the sense of the way the handles feel. If I had to compare it to the Switch Pro controller, they're a little bit thicker, which is actually really nice. I don't have the largest hands. I probably wear a size, medium or large glove, but the actual feel in the hands, to me at least, is pretty much perfect. Well, I can't help myself. Whenever a new controller comes out, usually the first thing I do, rather than playing with it, is actually tear it apart, because, I don't know, that's just kind of what I do around here. But anyway, the first thing I noticed is there are no screws on this controller, which obviously means it's a completely clipped case. So what I'm going to do is use this pry tool to go ahead and run it around the edges. Now I figure kind of this black trim piece needs to come off first because, well, realistically it's the only place to logically start. So I'm going to go ahead and run this around here and see if I can't pop this thing off. Okay, with that thing off, that was probably the easiest part of this entire operation, and I'm not going to lie, from here on out, it's going to get a little bit difficult. Now, fortunately, there are two screws that are very obvious, so we're going to take those out next, and then we're going to figure out how to separate the two halves of this shell. So after working with the pry tool for a little bit and continuing to separate the two halves of the shell, I kind of got to a point where I couldn't really get any further with the pry tool. In essence, it kind of just stopped at the shoulder buttons, and I really couldn't figure out how to open it any further from there. Unfortunately, as it currently sits, there really are no videos or articles online on how to disassemble a DualSense controller. So maybe I can just quickly talk about exactly how you want to do this properly so you don't end up like me. Now what you want to do is you want to remove R1 and L1, and once they're removed, it's going to expose a screw. From there, you can simply unscrew it and the two halves completely pop apart. Now unfortunately for me, I couldn't quite figure that part out, and well, long and short of it, I just ended up breaking the screw. Now, it doesn't affect anything, I can still put the controller completely back together, but hey, so you don't have to struggle with it like me, that's the easy way to do it. Now the first thing you're greeted with upon opening is the battery, and the best part of this battery, it's 1560 milliamp hours. Now in theory, this should be a significant improvement over the DualShock from the PS4. However, a lot still remains to be seen, especially with how these devs end up using some of the adaptive controls with this controller. Now I don't have a PS5 to test on, unfortunately, but by the God of War, please help us that this controller lasts longer than the DualShock on the PS4. Now with the battery out, everything from here is actually pretty straightforward. You're going to see the battery tray, which is easy enough to get out just by removing a couple screws, pop out a couple ribbon cables, and really you're into the guts of the controller. So the first thing I wanted to check out was both the D-pad and the buttons. And on the D-pad, I just wanted to check out the pivot point on there, and it looks really good. So hopefully that should mean no multiple button presses or anything like that when we're playing fighting games. The buttons themselves, you can tell they kind of did a two-part injection mold, and I think that's pretty awesome. Like I said, these things look fantastic. All these parts, I'm interested in doing some mods on later, but hey, that's for another video. Next, I really wanted to see what make those adaptive triggers tick. It's one of those things where it's a really cool feature, and I was just super curious exactly how it worked. Now, you can see that basically there's a tooth and gear system that's connected to both the trigger as well as this little motor. And effectively what this is going to do is that motor is going to drive that toothed gear, and it's going to allow the trigger to either be more or less difficult to push down. Like I said, ultimately this is a really cool feature, but my question is how durable is it? And while I can't quite answer that question right away, I can tell you just when I apply a lot of force to it, it's pretty sturdy. However, I can't help but wonder if this is going to be a point of failure later in the controller's life. Inspecting the rest of the controller PCB, nothing really jumps out at me that's concerning per se. The only piece I don't like here is the way that the front-facing buttons connect back to the main controller PCB, which houses the Bluetooth and other logic for the controller. Basically, they're using a friction fit pad there as opposed to kind of an FFC cable or something along those lines. And obviously this is being done as a cost-saving measure. However, Sony's been using this design for a while, and while it's worked for them in the past, it's one of those things where I could just see this being a problem later on. And specifically in the PS3 controller, it kind of was. So overall, what do I think of this thing? Well, from a fit and finish and feel, this thing is an extremely premium product. Not only does it look great, but it feels great too. There are a few things on the inside that do concern me, especially when it comes time to serviceability. Getting into this controller is extremely difficult, especially for your average person, and I don't see many people wanting to service this thing themselves. I also have a little bit of concern with the adaptive triggers, but I think more time is needed to tell whether that'll become an issue or not. As for me, with this thing sitting here open, I think I might have to attempt to mod this. So if you guys want to see me mod it, let me know in the comments below. And hey, I think we can deck this thing out and make it look absolutely awesome. Anyway, if you guys enjoyed this video, please give me a comment, a like, and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys for the next one here soon.